Hi, I'm Theo, and I'm here to talk about code transformation with Romeo Stevens. Romeo, I discovered code transformation through your tweets and blog posts, and when I had my first experience in July last year, I was blown away by how simple and powerful this practice is. Since then, I've had many more transformative experiences and also guided a lot of sessions for other people. I'm continually impressed by the power of this technique, and I understand why you're such a big shill for it. And before we jump into it, I'll take a quick shot at summarizing what core transformation is about. I think Milan Griffiths quoted you as saying core transformation is like if IFS and focusing had a baby that knows recursion. And I find that very apt. And when I try to explain it to people, I find it useful to contrast it with IFS. And so with IFS, the idea is to connect with the protector and understand what it is that the part does not want us to feel. We then lovingly persuade the protector to let us feel through those things, and so that we can integrate it and let go of the burden that we're holding on to. Now, with core transformation, the contrast is that rather than trying to understand what the part does not want us to feel, we ask the part what it is trying to get for us, what it wants us to feel. And then we recurse on that question, feeling our way through deeper and deeper wants until we get to a deepest want that the core transformation process calls a core state. At this point, we help the part realize that it does not have to go through a series of intended outcomes to get that want. It can access it right now. It is unconditional. And it's a very surreal experience because done right, you actually get to experience these exotic states of consciousness that are otherwise very elusive. And an example of this would be a part that makes you feel anxious, wants you to feel safe, which would lead to more peace, which would lead to relaxation, which would lead to flow, and then ultimately self transcendence. And so this chain of wants reflects a pattern that's you in a blog post refer to as a very deceptively simple pattern of suffering, something that we are intimately familiar with, that we make a contract to suffer until we get our desires met. We sacrifice peace, clarity, joy for to until our quests are completed. I want to get more into this pattern to start with, and to get a sense of where this pattern originates from and why it is such a problematic pattern. And what's the alternate way of being and why is it superior?
Hmm. Yeah, I think that was a pretty good summary. For the origin of the pattern, uh, I think there's probably a few things going on. Probably people have some different theories, and I'm not sure it's fully sketched out. My personal guess is something like there's a very, very early transition that everyone goes through, where before this transition, you are a baby and your needs are met without you needing to do anything, right? You can crap your pants and your needs are still met. And then at some point, the parents start to behaviorally shape. So that's weaning you off of breast milk, potty training, wearing clothes, like very, very basic early things.
Yeah.
And at this point, I think it feels like care and safety and affection and various things go from feeling totally unconditional to
Mhm.
feeling conditional. Because the parents do things they give us negative reinforcement. Things start happening, and so that's actually a very traumatic transition to go from totally unconditional love and safety to I need to behave in certain ways to get my needs met. Um, and I think that can be varying levels of traumatic and in different ways. And I think this is what Freud was on about, the like oral anal genital thing.
Mhm.
I think there was something there. I think it got all distorted and turned into some sort of crazy system. But
Yeah.
at a very basic level, I think that there's simple things like that. And then the way that that was handled sets us up to start doing that internalization of I need to be certain ways.
Mhm.
And I need to use negative reinforcement on myself. So if I use negative reinforcement on myself, then uh, I have some control over that. And so
Right.
that's better than waiting until I get negative reinforcement from outside. And it's especially scary to receive negative reinforcement from your parents, right?
Yeah.
So if I can control that, if I can do that myself, then I maintain some control. And so then we start layering. And I think in the early days, it's still pretty simple. It's right. It's like one level of layering. Like, okay, I will do this thing that I don't really like, and then something else that I like will happen.
Yeah.
But then it starts getting built up in multiple layers. And before you know it, you know, you're 10 or 12 layers deep. And you don't even remember having laid down all those layers of conditioning.
Mhm.
Um, where the first time you go through a core transformation with someone, you know, they have 10 or 12 objections before they're
Yeah.
allowed to feel any positive emotion. And it's
Yeah.
like, how did the system ever get like this? This is crazy. Um, and yeah, people have lots of layers of justification for that. Why it's not safe to feel positive emotions. And you know, standing from the outside, that can seem rather silly, but from the inside, this always seems rather compelling. It's like, oh, I must be this way. I can't do that. If I did this, then this bad thing would happen. And it's all tacit, right? It's all just spaghetti code
Yeah.
lying there until you go investigate it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what's the alternate way of being that seems counterintuitive, but like is more superior and like eases a lot of suffering while still getting our needs met?
I think your various parts, by default, our various parts don't necessarily have a very developed theory of mind, right? So they don't really understand what other parts are doing. Those parts are
True.
different from them. So it's not obvious. And then if all of these different parts trying to get our different needs met have all been layering, it's not at all obvious to the parts by default that they actually share a bunch of underlying motivational structure.
Mhm.
So they actually do need that help in that development and that time, that quality time spent with them, of having it explained to them in very simple terms of like, hey, do you see that this part's trying to accomplish this part's, so that they can start to realize like, oh, their goals are not at odds with each other. Their strategies might have been at odds with each other, but those can also be cleaned up as you go, right? You realize that these strategies, oh, that actually wasn't getting my needs met in the way I thought it was. So you clean up
Yeah.
the strategies, you realize the underlying goals are actually drawn from a much smaller space, and that they're all um, in principle commensurate with each other. They can be mutually met. And then the parts start to just experience a lot more harmoniousness and trust. And then when the system's been through that a few dozen times,
Mhm.
this things sort of the brain starts to close the loop a little bit more easily. Parts sort of start getting on board with this. They're like, oh yeah, I've observed this working. Um, this is not that hard, right? I have enough trust that I'm willing to set aside temporarily my assumptions about whatever it is, or fights that I've had with other parts,
Yeah.
to try to see how this goes. At which point, um, things just start flowing a lot more easily because the parts just aren't as in much conflict with each other about those different strategies. And that different way of being comes more online as you do it a few dozen to 100 times.
Mhm.
It starts to become naturally just available as a set of mental moves. Of just anytime an aversive emotion shows up, you realize, oh, the things that I call aversive emotions,
Mhm.
I call them that because they were entangled with like bad strategies, bad side effects, conflicts with other parts, like all these things. But actually, the energy of each individual type of like emotional feeling tone
Mhm.
has something wholesome to contribute to the system as a whole. And once I'm in touch with that, a lot of these problematic emotions become no problem, right? Because you just habitually are getting in touch with what the positive intent is. Um, and so yeah, there's a transformation of fear and anger. You know, extreme states can still arise. Nobody is doing a few rounds of psychotherapy and then suddenly they're fearless and able
Yeah.
to walk into a lion's cage.
Yeah.
But you're starting to see how all of the different feelings are trying to take care of you in different ways, and like things just become quite a bit easier from that point.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And I want to understand at a slightly deeper level what's actually happening when we are doing the core transformation process and getting to the core state. what exactly are these core states? And yeah, I'm also curious how such a simple inquiry can lead us to some very elusive states of consciousness.
Hmm. I'm not sure if anyone really knows. So the thing is I think that the core states are the Brahma Viharas from Buddhism, as I've you've probably seen me mention. Um, in the Buddhist world, the Brahma Viharas are the uh, qualities that remain after full deconditioning has taken place. So you've deconditioned all of the trauma, all of the laid down layering, all of it's gone. You've actually like burned through everything. And somehow these core qualities are just still there. And I've never seen anything that like speculates about this or tries to explain why they're still there.
Mhm.
I'm sure maybe I haven't. I just glossed over it because it was too weird and poetic or metaphysical or some other sort of weirdness.
Mhm.
But the standard position in Buddhism is something like, yeah, that's like the natural state of consciousness, like when it's not doing any other of its normal bullshit.
Yeah, yeah. I also find the Dzogchen view relevant here, the idea that you already have the Buddha nature or you're already enlightened, and somehow this inquiry is helping us tap into that state. And so you've done hundreds of hours of core transformation exploration in your journey for yourself and others. And for you personally, what have been some of the biggest breakthroughs that core transformation enabled? And also curious to hear what have been some of the emergent effects or benefits of becoming core transformation, becoming proficient at core transformation, like you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I would say that since the biggest breakthroughs for me have been meditation related,
Mhm.
then core transformation I think of largely as it's a useful standalone technique, but I think of it as a supporting scaffolding for a serious meditation practice. And the way that that works is um, normally the thing that most people have heard of is taking something like the breath as your meditation object.
Yeah,
Um, there are schools that take Brahma Viharas as meditation objects. And so, in this world of mapping these to the Brahma Viharas, or saying that they're the same thing, well, if you reach a core state, you can then just take that core state as a meditation object.
yeah,
And there's a very long history of doing this. Not even non-Buddhist traditions. This is a thing. Um, so Brahma Viharas, just to name them, in case people aren't familiar, loving kindness, compassion, appreciative joy, and equanimity.
yeah.
So these are some pretty powerful. Equanimity in particular, we would see is related to the fourth jhana,
Mhm.
and the peace that people get in touch with as a core state is very clearly in the same territory of this.
Yeah,
So yeah, you're getting into and as the Buddha says, equanimity is not enlightenment, but it is the closest thing to enlightenment. It's like right
Mhm.
next door.
Yeah,
So you're in the right area when you get to that piece. So taking that as a meditation object, yeah, that's going to be jet fuel for a lot of people's practice. And compared to something drier like dry insight, or even just struggling with breath meditation for years and years, a lot of people will do this and find that they start getting progress like right away.
yeah,
So it can be really powerful.
yeah. I also found it very useful working with hindrances. And I think you also talk about how, like, if you cannot access loving kindness, like core transformation can help you work with the hindrance and achieve a breakthrough. So, yeah, that specifically I found it very useful. And yeah, next, now to talk about how core transformation is specifically very useful for dealing with complex trauma. I find IFS very useful for working with negative incident trauma because there's specific stuff that you can unpack and work through. But core transformation seems to be very useful for yeah trauma of lack of missing out on emotional nourishment in your early developmental years, for losing out on safety or affection or touch. And yeah, curious to hear what your experience has been personally and guiding sessions for other people, how core transformation is specifically useful for complex trauma compared to other modalities?
I haven't worked with too many cases of complex trauma, at least explicitly, that I know of. It is very tricky, and there's almost like a bomb diffusal process that occurs in such cases where you don't really know what's going to be the safest thing to work with first, because a lot of the stuff is like just it's too intense for them to work directly with
Yeah.
without pharmaceutical enhancement. Um, I mean, the most experience that I've had with that kind of thing is sort of uh, getting people to tap into grief that is unprocessed about negative experiences. And once they have actually grieved the sense of loss or the negative things that happened in the past, oftentimes they're then able to get in touch with the part can unstick, right? If the part hasn't grieved, then it's going to be like stuck priors. But yeah, other than that, with CTPSD or CPTSD, I mean, I personally find that there's a lot of stuff in there around the reason that their trauma is shaped in the particular way it is often combined with some sort of developmental thing that they have going on. So they missed out on some sort of key emotional processing or coping strategies as children, and then something came along that sort of like totally like would have stressed that system for most people, but for them they just don't have it, and so it just like hits them full force.
Yeah.
And it's really really bad. So I often find that before you can actually address the direct material of the PTSD, you have to go back and start to build out that capacity for that coping mechanism that would have been there, so that their adult self can sort of then, or more developed self can then be the one going and re-experiencing that those memories,
Yeah.
and deploying that coping strategy that they didn't have before. And so that's a slightly different modality than core transformation. That, I mean, I still will use a core transformation modality with people. But I would often bring in things like an ideal parent protocol, or just trying to evaluate what beliefs about self, other, and world, like basic, and yeah, you might do core transformation moves with those, right? So if
Yeah.
some basic aspect of self, other, or world feels deeply unsafe, yeah, like that spaghetti code of that needs to be sort of traced out and worked with.
Yeah. I've had some sessions where I had the opportunity to do both core transformation plus IFS. And so you start with core transformation, you get to a core state, which now serves as a powerful positive attractor. And in IFS terms, like just increases the self energy. And from that place, you can now invite the protector to lead you to the exile in IFS terms, and then re-experience those memories in the backdrop of this intensely powerful positive state, which I think allows for a lot of powerful processing. And yeah, to talk about grieving, for personally me, core transformation has also been serving as a medium of grieving, sometimes getting in touch with some of our wants, which originate from a place of lack. So getting in touch with that want also puts me in touch with the loss of that thing in my life, and often triggers spontaneous sobbing. And so without even getting to the core state, just getting in touch with these wants, they basically act as positive triggers. And I found it very useful that this modality gives people positive triggers. Usually we unpack stuff based on negative triggers from our life. Someone hurts us or something goes wrong, which then brings a lot of suffering to surface. So we then unpack stuff. But code transformation brings up stuff that is connected to something like feeling loved, how feeling loved can be scary for a lot of people because there's a lot of pain associated with it. And so getting to feel these positive things uncovers these hidden pain or feelings of loss that otherwise would have remained latent for a long, long time until we encountered those positive triggers in our life. And yeah, it's also cool how core transformation uncovers hidden conflicting patterns. Like you mentioned, like it can, like things can go like 8, 10, 12 layers deep until you get to a core state. And so even if you're not getting to a core state, the process of like encountering a new objection after a new objection brings so much interesting stuff to surface that you otherwise would not have encountered in other explorations. Mhm. And so common objections that people come up with when like core transformation comes up is one is the wire herding objections that you address in your blog post. A lot of people are resistant to the idea of, yeah, feeling good before achieving their desired outcome. And other objection that comes up for me is that people ask like, are we just imagining things or making it all up? Like, it's just a feel good thing. Now, core transformation has a way of unpacking these objections, but for some people, these objections or concerns can be strong enough to not engage with the process itself. And yeah, I'd love to hear your responses to these general objections.
Yeah, the wire heading thing is interesting. I keep uncovering new aspects of it. It makes sense to me that this would be a general problem of like nervous system design that like evolution had. It's like, well, if you're going to have these reward circuits, like how do you make sure they don't go like, close the loop themselves?
Yeah.
How do you keep the organism in tight feedback loop with its environment?
Mhm.
So yeah, it's somewhat individual per person. With regard to the sorry, what was the second thing you mentioned?
The second thing was like, are we just imagining things and making it all up, or is it just
Yes.
about feeling good?
So that actually, yeah, that helped. Um, the great thing that I found with core transformation is that it kind of doesn't matter, which might sound crazy at first, but it's
Mhm.
something like you can start off with something that's just sort of like semi-confabulated. You're like, maybe it's this. I can't think of anything better. Let's just go with it. And
Yeah.
it will actually sort of self-repair as you go because you try to go deeper and then you get objections. And it's like
Mhm.
the objections can be of the form of like, oh wait, it's not quite about that. It's about this other thing. So as long as you are getting real about the somatic feelings in the body
Mhm.
and noticing the memories that are coming up in their contents, instead of getting lost in sort of explaining mind or like just sort of discursive verbal looping, right? So as long as you're retouching into the actual feelings and activations that are happening, it will be self-correcting. So at first it might seem a little bit fake, but after a few layers of objections, you start diving down, and it's like, no, it's starting to touch real things.
Yeah.
And that's been universal experience. I haven't had anyone have that problem uh, of it not self-correcting in that way, and so that gives you a foothold for the wire heading objection, right? Because it's like,
Mhm.
while I'm like, parts that are concerned about this, it's like, okay, the way that we're going to go through this process, we're only going to advance once those parts have their concerns addressed for real. It's not going to be some fake thing, right? Like
Yeah.
they're allowed to object. Those objections are legitimate, and things are only going to advance when those parts like actually have trust that we're dealing with a real thing and that this is not bullshit. It's kind of like the trust that you get in IFS for like protectors allowing you to touch in with exiles. It's like the protectors really have to feel that you are in a place of non-judgment and like loving kindness and
Yeah.
just wanting to help the parts before they will let you do what you want to do.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, speaking of working through the memories, it would be interesting to look at core transformation from the coherence therapy lens. So there's a step explicitly in core transformation where we grow up the part and we invite the part to evolved from their current age to our present age with the core state present at every moment of time along the way. Not very familiar with uh, coherence therapy, but that seems like in the territory of memory reconsolidation. And yeah, would love to hear more about what's happening there.
Yeah, so I think my personal hypothesis about this is something like a lot of parts, if you add up all of their actual moments where they have access to full consciousness,
Yeah.
they might be like, hardly any time has passed for them since the experience that they have. This is common in PTSD as well, right? It's like for the parts it hasn't been any time at all because the amount of time that they actually spend in consciousness is like minutes, hours at the most, or something like that.
Mm.
So I think that the normal way of thinking about ourselves is sort of having this like timeline, um, sort of breaks down when we really start examining our own relationship with time. And I think that a lot of people, like, for example, one of the things that's getting diagnosed as ADHD is partially a disordered relationship with time.
Mm.
Um, so I think a lot of our parts just sort of don't really have time-like structures, data structures. I think like that might be literally what's going on. Is just that that's not tagged everywhere in the system consistently.
Yeah.
Different parts might have wildly different relationships to time,
Mhm.
and so I think the timeline trick is something like trying to give access to time passing as
Yeah.
an experience to lots of different parts. And I think that when you do this enough, if this is right, if this is right as a hypothesis, then
Mhm.
doing that a bunch of times with a bunch of different parts, and then having the experience of people should have an experience of like viscerally some sort of qualitative shift at some point where it
Yeah.
feels like they have better access to time, and that this should actually show up in like diagnostic criteria for other things that have problematic relationship with time, autism, ADHD, or whatever other issues that have disordered relationship with time as a diagnostic criteria.
Hmm. Yeah. Fascinating. And yeah, now coming to more general meditation territory stuff, you have a tweet that goes something like craving is not desire, but specifically desire born out of ignorance to how things really are. And the way to tell difference is to trace the desire to its root, and you will find one of two things: your actual values or a snarly loop with no ground. And as for how one traces a desire to its root, you talk about training in core transformation causes the mind to habitually trace such patterns. And yeah, I'd love for you to go a bit more deep into that.
Yeah, I mean, I think core transformation just sort of directly trains some of the mental moves that would be for the Dharma factor of investigation, right? So this is one of the 7 factors for awakening. This is, considered a big deal skill to train up in, like that's going to help you everywhere in your life. So I don't think that. So I mentioned before that it's really great to have this skill of being able to see not only positive intentions in yourself, but once you trained it, you start being able to see positive intentions in others too, right? So other
Yeah.
people are experiencing aversive emotions, and it's just like, oh, I've seen this before. That's probably one of and you don't want to like shove your experience down other people's throat,
Mhm.
um, but it does make it easy for you to scaffold for them. You're like, hey, it sounds like maybe it's this, maybe it's that, and they're like, oh, huh, I never thought of that. Like, right? So
Mhm.
um, so there's that mental move. Um, but the mental move in general of investigation is not just useful there; it's useful all over the place, right? It's useful for all
Yeah.
of the other meditation skills and non-meditation, just normal daily life skills. Because there's other sorts of investigations you do of causal reality, social dynamics, your relationships
Mhm.
with your peers and partners,
Mhm.
uh, where yeah, those investigative skills are gonna help you quite a lot. Um, and then wholesome, unwholesome. Let's see what I'm trying to say about that. Yeah, I think you already mentioned the important bit, which is sort of like the core states are like wholesome in and of themselves. It's a directly apprehendable quality.
Yeah.
Uh, and then the unwholesome is also, yeah, just like what can I say about the root of unwholesomeness? like asymmetry, where asymmetry is actually one of the potential translations of tanha, because the metaphor that tanha is craving, that is usually translated as craving,
Mhm.
which is supposedly the root of suffering according to Buddhist sort of conception of the world. The core metaphor of that is a hole, the axle hole for a wagon wheel
Mhm.
that has become the grease has become dirty, such that the wagon wheel no longer sort of rolls cleanly.
Yeah.
And so the asymmetry of that bumping you along instead of having a smooth ride,
Mhm.
to me implies that asymmetry in the phenomenological space is a core, like it's a signature that people are trying to point to. Um, and
Right.
so one of those asymmetries is unwholesomeness, right? So if you care only about your own experience and don't care about some other person's experience,
Mhm.
um, there's an asymmetry between you in how you're sort of regarding the value of the qualia, the experiences.
Mhm.
So as without, so within, and vice versa, right? If you don't care about some other person's experience, probably also there's dynamics within you where your parts don't care about the experience of some other part of you,
Yeah.
right? If it doesn't seem useful to their goal. So that asymmetry within you is causing those frictional conflicts, right?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so I would say people have accidentally interpreted wholesome unwholesome as connecting to the moral layer, where moral reasoning is sort of an identifiable layer. In, you know, when you're diving through the layers, you can sort of
Right.
identify it as a layer of something that you do about how things should be. Um, but I think this is a mistake. Wholesome and unwholesome are actually just like logical constructs once you really get down to their root.
Yeah. Yeah. And to come back to your point about when you start seeing other people's aversive emotions or even like dark impulses as uh, at the root of it, if you trace it down completely, there's this wholesome want. And that's why I also find co-transformation specifically very useful for working with our darker impulses, our shadow side. And so in IFS, we often ask the part, do you like doing this job? And a lot of parts are like, no, I'm exhausted. I would not do this. But if you ask some of our parts that crave power or that, yeah, uh, crave influence, if you ask these parts, do you like doing this job? The answer sometimes you get is yes, and I want more of this. And this is where core transformation becomes very useful, where we invite the part to lean into that want and like take it to its ultimate deepest want and help the part realize that it's already here. And I think it's also uh, brings a lot of peace and self-acceptance when you realize that your darker side that you try to like shame yourself for, that you try to push away, has these wholesome wants for you. Um, and so now I want to talk about what potential limits or risks of something like co-transformation might be. Mark Lipman talks about how a lot of these modalities, including co-transformation, sort of trade off on local versus global. They often yield valuable local breakthroughs or changes while messing up a bunch of shit outside that local area, and sometimes in ways that are hard to detect and realize. It seems like code transformation sort of has a built-in checking mechanism to prevent this. Any global objections or concerns from other parts of the system will automatically come up in course of the process. And so yeah, I'm curious if that is enough. Will our minds always throw objections when we are making a bad global trade-off? And in general, what are some of the limits or risks of engaging with code transformation intensely like you have for hundreds of hours and running it dozens of times?
Yeah, so this is great because I actually just asked my meditation teacher about that this week.
Hmm.
And I won't name names because I don't want to put words in their mouth, because like my paraphrase is not going to be exactly what they said, and these distinctions can matter. So
Yeah.
I'll just give my gloss of what
Mhm.
they were saying. It's something like, so in the six realms model, this is sort of an analytic process in a lot of ways. It's this stepwise algorithm that sort of steps through things and tries to evaluate and make distinctions and things. So this is a very human realm type process,
Yeah.
and so that means that it's inherently limited. You know, if you have someone that's in Hell Realm or in Hungry Ghost Realm where it's just an awful experience,
Hmm.
and you say, "Hey, have you tried being in Human Realm?" You know, they're gonna be like, "Fuck you!" Like,
Yeah.
I'm being tortured, right? Don't tell me to like do some like computer algorithm to like fix myself. Like, this is what is this,
Yeah.
right? And I've had this experience before because I'm not skilled enough yet to be able to
Mhm.
sort of fully understand how deep the Hell Realms can go.
Yeah.
Um, so he said that that's a limitation, and with that comes, yeah, a danger of that if you think that this is a panacea and just going to be able to repair everything, it's like, no, you're going to cause people to have a bad time, or that you know, hungry ghosts are going to think they're doing something wrong and that they're not good enough, that the process doesn't work for them because they're broken in some
Mm.
fundamental way. And you can try to work with these a little bit, but if you're up here in human realm being like, just do the process, bro, and they're having some sort of negative experience, there has to be an extra step of of figuring out, are they capable? Can I figure out a way to go down into that realm with them? Um,
Yeah.
See what they're experiencing, see if it's possible for them to have the capacity or
Yeah.
the uncontracted awareness enough to be able to do this process. So Connie Ray Andreas, the author of Core Transformation, she also ran into this problem. She phrases it totally differently. She doesn't talk about the realms or anything,
Hmm.
but she invented her other technique, coming to wholeness, because after many years of doing core transformation with people, she found people who were what she said were like treatment resistant, that they were just having a really hard time with core transformation. And so she eventually stumbled upon this other technique. And what's interesting about coming to wholeness is that it's um, almost the opposite move of core transformation. So if core transformation cuts down through the layers,
Hmm.
coming to wholeness pulls back, or like sort of zooms up and out, and tries to uncontract awareness from around these particular mental objects of, you know,
Yeah.
what are you feeling, what's the bodily sensation, what are the things, and that's what some people need, right? So
Mhm.
Mark Littman, you mentioned, he talks about some dangers. He talks about how any kind of particular technique, um, generally, especially if done unskillfully, but even if done skillfully, will often, you'll find that it's loosening things up in some areas of the system, but also it's tightening in other areas.
Yeah.
And so eventually you are going to have to go sort of untighten whatever's happening over there. So this coming to wholeness is kind of a generalized,
Mhm.
how can you like loosen up uncontract awareness, and I think it's the same move as in IFS, where they probably discovered this after some time of working with people, where the first move of IFS is like getting to witness consciousness almost, right? It's pulling back to sort of bigger self.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people have stumbled upon the same exact thing in different ways. So learning both of these moves to be able to zoom in and cut and investigate and cut and make distinctions and
Mhm.
very, very tightly. And then also being able to sort of loosen up, relax, open up awareness, see where this is all coming from, see
Yeah.
what the stance is. The other thing that my meditation teacher shared with me about this is, so he said it's human realm,
Mhm.
and he really wanted to zoom in on the step, in opening the heart of compassion, the book. They have a version of this that they call aspirational inquiry. It's on page 119.
Mhm.
It's very good. I recommend, even if people aren't going to read the whole core transformation book, at least check out the 9-step process that they mention on in opening the heart of compassion.
Yeah.
And he really wanted to zoom in on step two. And step two in aspirational inquiry is, what's your whole stance or attitude towards the situation? And he's like, really just spend a lot of time with that. And there's a lot of benefit just there. And that'll help you even on for people who aren't in human realm and can't work with the rest of the process. That particular step is going to be helpful for a much broader set of states and conditions that people might be in.
Yeah. Could you give an example of that?
Um, Well, it's like, let's say I've been having some trouble. Let's say the prompt is that I've been having trouble at work with like a coworker where I just really don't like some way that they're acting, and I haven't really decided how I want to orient towards that. So I can sort of start to feel into that. that whole situation and the way it makes me feel, and it's like, oh, it feels kind of bad, and I feel a little stuck. And then I can just sort of observe what my sort of attitude is in that moment, right? It's like,
Mm.
okay, I'm orienting towards that situation, and then what's my attitude, right? It's kind of like a slight disgust and more like a focusing type thing, right?
Mhm.
Um, wanting to push myself away from the situation, avoidance, right? Just sort of these broad yeah, general attitudes or stances that the body might be in. And then just hanging out with that for a bit, because that's just quality time with a part that,
Yeah.
because it's aversive, has been pushed out of consciousness a lot, right?
Yeah.
Um, so even just spending a few minutes of quality time with that will give that a little bit of time to process, and then a little bit of space can probably open up, because the natural half-life of emotions like that is 30 seconds to a minute if they're just sort
Yeah.
of not resisted, right? So going through that 30 seconds to a minute at least, um, until you get a little bit of relief, a little bit of space, and then going from there.
Got it. Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. And I'm also curious for someone like me, I'm getting a lot of mileage from code transformation at the moment, and I have this impulse to lean into it heavily, like you did at some point in your journey. And so for you, I'm curious, what bad trade-offs happened, or what other areas of system tighten up as you did a lot of code transformation. And then can you not just do code transformation in those areas as well and just untwist things and just continue to derive benefits from code transformation?
Yeah. So, um, in the not a panacea category of things,
Hmm.
um, people can fall into what I like to call the integration trap, where they're integrating, where core transformation is a style of integration, practice. There's other
Yeah,
psychotherapy techniques, yoga, and various other types of techniques, relational practices that are good for sort of integration,
yeah.
um, integrating our different parts. But it's yeah, you can fall into the integration trap, and what that means is sort of like you are getting better at processing things,
Hmm.
but you are never having insights that cause you to change. How do I put this? In the course of your days, you have experiences, and
Hmm.
then you have undigested chunks, and it's like you can get better at digesting them.
Hmm.
Um, but if you never have any insights into like the core of what's going on and why they occur this way, they might just still keep coming in exactly the same way. And so it's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole. It's like this endless, like I'm going to integrate that, I'm going to integrate that, and then the next day comes in more aversive emotions, and I have to integrate that, and it just sort of reaches this equilibrium of never really improving in a fundamental way. Like you get better at working with the aversive emotions, and things do improve, but you don't get these really big shifts where you just orient to these in a totally new way. Um, and so that's the purview of like formal meditation practice, right? So
Oh.
if you take if you take the core states as an integration, sorry, too many word salad. If you take the core states as your
Mhm.
meditation object, do concentration meditation with them, and then emerge from that state, feeling really, really good, and then do insight meditation onto, why is it that this feels so good? Like, what is it that's like deeply good about this?
Yeah.
Um, then you start having deeper insights. So insights that aren't the sort of normal emotional insights that you have from core transformation. So in a normal integration practice like core transformation, you have insights of the form like, oh, I see that like hating my coworker is like counterproductive, or like I see that the way I hold this in my body and like it's like actually a very aversive to hold in my body.
Yeah.
Deeper insights are of like the form, hey, my part is like orienting towards experience in general in this like really weird way. And it's like it's not something you can really verbally describe. I've described it sometimes as like a data structure. It's like that part's whole way of orienting towards reality is like very weirdly shaped. And
Mm.
like you suddenly apprehend that. And then like apprehending it gives it some space, and it's able to like unclench or unmake itself from this really weird twisted up shape that it's been in.
Right.
And that tends to cause the sort of deeper switches where, um something that was a problem before just isn't a problem anymore. So before it was like a problem, but now I'm really good at dealing with the problem, right? And now it's not a problem at all, right? So that's a different kind of shift. So
Right.
those shifts ultimately are like deeper and more important and impactful. But integration is, as I said, like a very helpful scaffold for getting there.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. And yeah, I love to talk a bit about peer counseling now. Like you're a big believer in that idea and you feel like it has a lot of promise. To start with, could you unpack what peer counseling means to you and why that can be a really valuable tool as we navigate all these crises our civilization is facing?
Yeah. So there's a major problem where therapy in general doesn't show uh, much improvement with years of experience. So this is multiple things going on there. Uh, it still needs a lot of more research to understand what's going on, but basically that between that and the fact that workbooks can often be as good as professional therapists
Mhm.
um, implies that you can get a lot of mileage out of just amateurs just talking with each other, right?
Yeah.
Provided that there's some basic understanding of like safety measures in place.
Mhm.
And there's also just like the one to many problem. Like there's just literally not enough therapists to work with everyone, right?
Yeah.
And they're expensive, and the fit is bad for a lot of people. They have to like cycle through many of them before they find one that is a good fit. Um, and the expense just isn't reachable for a lot of people.
Yes.
So people by default are going to do what they've always done before therapy was invented, relatively
Mhm.
recently. You
Yeah.
talk with your friends, right? You talk with your
Yeah.
peers, you talk with parents, mentors. And so if people in those settings can be given a fairly easy to learn, sparse sort of set of techniques
Yeah.
that improve what they're already doing, which is just showing up for your friends, right? And talking
Mhm.
them through their problems. Then you can, yeah, drastically increase the effectiveness of people, what people are already doing. And then that scales dramatically better than something that's like some sort of complicated training program to like create professionals, right? If it's like
Yeah.
if each person that standard pyramid scheme reasoning, right? If each person that you teach peer counseling
Mhm.
to teaches it to
Yeah.
other people, then it can sort of naturally spread out. And there will be problems. People will abuse it. People will use it incorrectly and cause problems. But overall, this is going to be a major improvement, is my guess,
Yeah.
for a lot of people.
Yeah, definitely. And I think core transformation also like is very accessible for something like this. It's simple, it's in a way algorithmic, and yeah, there's a well-defined step-by-step process, even though something like that can has its own downsides. But yeah, for the layperson, it's very easy to run a simple inquiry and just refer to the steps. And yeah, did you have any advice on how to get the most out of core transformation, where some failure modes of core transformation are, and how people can avoid them, and yeah, generally, yeah, derive the benefits that this technique promises?
I'd say the biggest thing is just consistency, because there's always going to be an improvement in skill with repetition, right? So uh, the biggest thing that I tell everyone that hears about it is like, you know, read the first 50 pages of the book, which outlines the whole process. You don't even need to go through the rest.
Yeah.
And just try it out with a friend who's also interested. And if, twice a week, you facilitate for them once and they facilitate for you once, and
Mhm.
you just stick with that for a few weeks, the first, 10 hours that you do is going to be a dramatic increase in your understanding of like what this process is and how it works for you.
Yeah.
Um, so just get over the hump, you know, just and it really helps to be doing it one-on-one with a person, because you do feel some like social uh, I guess obligation's a bad word, but like you feel this desire to reciprocate if the person's facilitating for you,
Yeah.
um, and yeah, just having a place to show up prioritizing it for a few weeks. It doesn't have to be forever, right? It's
Mhm.
literally just, hey, for the next 6 weeks, let's do this twice a week. So that's the biggest thing. And then pitfalls that people run into. Um, I'd say the number one biggest one is people don't start off with the intuition that absolutely anything can be treated as an objection to work with.
Yeah. Yeah.
So not liking the process, getting bored, getting the mind blanking out, getting sleepy,
Mhm.
mysterious reasons to avoid various things, that
Yeah.
can just be treated as an objection. And not as like, well, I'm gonna deal with the objection and then I can finally do the thing. It's like, no, a real objection. Like your
Yeah.
part detects that there's something wrong with this process, right? And it's not, it doesn't feel good. There's something about it that doesn't feel good.
Mhm.
So addressing that objection for real is going to mean slightly modifying it. You're modifying your understanding of it to like, okay, what would it look like to do a process that this part actually is interested in, and like,
Yeah.
what would it look like for it to actually have its concerns addressed? Um, so yeah, it can be tricky and weird at first. And as I've said many times, if people see me talk about this at all before,
Mhm.
I am fond of saying core transformation, it's very front loaded. So the reason that this process is not known about and that it's counterintuitive is the first 2 to 3 times that you do it, it's going to be the hardest it ever is, because the first few times it's a total mess. You get like a dozen layers of objections and it's all over the place and you don't even get through the whole process, or you don't even reach a core state. And so it's
Yeah.
very hard to stay motivated if you haven't tasted those positive outcomes yourself. And so you sort of have to stick with it for a little bit at first. Um, and then once you get through the whole cycle a couple times at least, the system starts to notice like good things. Some people are lucky, like they're able to do it right away, or only have a few layers of objections. But it's pretty common that people will have just a mess of spaghetti code up front. So yeah, it really is about getting past that. And I've said before, I think one of the things that's benefited me the most is one of the beliefs that I have is that you can in fact get big benefits out of very kind of simple mechanical processes. So
Yeah.
if you sort of start off with a belief that like therapy workbooks couldn't possibly work, then they won't, right? But if you like sort of like, I don't really like this and it's not really resonating with me, but you sort of like force yourself to go through it a little bit, not force, but like, there's a little bit of like,
Nudge.
okay, I'm going to try to sit down and create a container,
Yeah.
get through some of it. It's sort of like the starter engine on the car, right? It's like you need a little bit of a jump to sort of get the main engine going. The main engine being the actual experience of like positive motivations.
Yeah.
But yeah, sometimes it needs a little bit of a kick, and so doing it on one other person can provide that kick when you're not feeling super motivated yourself.
Yeah. And I think another useful thing about doing code transformation or any kind of parts work with someone else holding space for you is one, you can let go of the constant self-monitoring and intellectualization or figuring out that would happen if you are doing it in your own head. And two, when someone's holding space for you, uh, it's less unlikely that you will get lost or you'll get sidetracked or completely end up somewhere else. That would usually happen if you're sitting by yourself. So if someone's holding space for you 60, 90 odd minutes, and every time you get sidetracked, gently bringing you back to where you were going, it allows you to go really deeper than like you would otherwise. And yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to talk about. And yeah, especially resonate with what you mentioned towards the end. It can be a bit mess for some people towards the early stages. Yeah, I was personally lucky. I just was able to access the core state right away. Yeah, that pretty much covers everything that I had to talk about. Anything else? Any other interesting insights or things that have landed for you over the course of years as you worked with this technique?
Oh, I mean, there's so much. Right, I've done it with so many people, but yeah, I think that probably that's a good chunk for people. Enough actionables and enough concepts. It's
Yeah.
probably a little too much already,
Yeah.
um, unless they're already familiar with it.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.